The air outside the Barrowland feels faintly damp, and somewhere along the street, a bus eases past in the Glasgow dark. It is late in the 1960s, and the city is still arranged around small routines, dance halls, pub corners, taxi ranks, and the long ride home after midnight. You begin here not with a chase, but with paper, with names written carefully, and with 3 evenings that seem separate at first. Each one left behind ordinary details. Who was seen at a doorway? Who remembered a conversation? Which route might have been taken across the city? In time, detectives noticed that those details leaned toward the same place, the same ballroom, the same patient question. The man they tried to picture was remembered as neat, polite, talkative, and somehow distinct enough to stay in the mind. But this case was never built in a single moment of certainty, only in witness statements, old maps, taxi memories, and files opened again under quieter light. So tonight, you can settle into the slow work of it and follow how Glasgow tried, piece by piece, to remember a man it could never quite name. At first, the files did not announce themselves as part of one pattern. They arrived in the ordinary way, through local police work, through statements taken in careful handwriting, through doors knocked on in the grey light of morning. One case belonged to the 23rd of February, 1968. Another would follow on the 16th of August, 1969. Then, a third came on the 31st of October, 1969. 3 women, 3 nights, and in the beginning, only the slow burden of separate inquiries. But police are trained to notice when separate things begin to bend toward each other. In each inquiry, there were signs that the evening had passed near the Barrowland Ballroom, that bright and well-known place in the East End where people went to dance, to meet friends, to hear music, and for a few hours feel carried along by the city. That detail did not prove anything on its own. In a city the size of Glasgow, many lives crossed through familiar rooms, but the repetition of the ballroom in these files was enough to make one detective, and then another, pause over the paperwork. A place becomes important that way, not because it looks dramatic, but because it returns too often in the margins. So the first concrete decision was a simple one. The inquiries could no longer sit apart. Detectives began to compare them side by side, setting dates beside witness accounts beside movement through the city, and movement beside the one location that seemed to stand quietly at the center. That choice changed the scale of the work. A murder inquiry asks who was present, who knew the victim, who had reason. A linked inquiry asks something wider and more difficult. It asks whether a stranger moved through different nights with the same habits, the same confidence, the same ability to leave only fragments behind. Once that question entered the room, the case became something else. The first woman was Patricia Docker, a young mother. Her movements on the evening of the 22nd of February into the early hours of the 23rd were traced as best they could be, though not without difficulty. Her husband believed she had gone out for a dance at the majestic ballroom. That seemed clear enough at the time, yet investigators later came to believe that she had in fact spent the evening at the Barrowland, perhaps because she had been refused entry elsewhere for not wearing what the venue required. That small uncertainty mattered more than it first appeared. If she had been at the Barrowland, then the ballroom was not just a possible background detail, it was the first point on a line that might extend forward into the next year. So officers went back over recollections that had seemed too ordinary to keep in the front of the file. Door staff were reconsidered. Admission habits were considered. Who might have seen her there, and who might not have noticed her at all, became newly important. This is how investigations often move, not by discovering something entirely new, but by returning to a detail that had not yet found its proper place. Then came Jemima MacDonald on the 16th of August, 1969. She had also spent part of her evening at the Barrowland. By then, detectives could no longer call the similarity accidental without first testing that thought very carefully. 2 women, both connected to the same dance hall. Both evenings ending with unanswered movements through the city after midnight. Both leaving behind witnesses who had seen company, but only briefly. and never with the kind of certainty an investigator hopes for. The consequence was immediate. Police widened the lens. The ballroom itself was no longer merely a setting. It became a practical line of inquiry. Officers began speaking more closely with staff, regulars, and anyone who understood how a Saturday night or a crowded evening moved around those doors. They needed to know where people stood, how couples met, where taxis tended to queue, which routes men and women usually took when the music ended. They were not looking for drama. They were looking for routine. Routine tells you where a stranger can hide. By the autumn of 1969, the city itself had begun to hold the shape of the investigation, not in a loud way, more in the sense that certain names and places had to be spoken again and again. The Barrowland, the East End, late buses, dance partners, a man seen talking easily, a man leaving with confidence. Then, on the 31st of October 1969, the third case brought the pattern into plain view. Helen Puttock had spent the evening at the Barrowland with her sister, Jean Langford. This time, there would be more than a passing recollection. This time, there would be hours of shared company, a taxi ride, a conversation remembered in unusual detail. But before that account settled into the center of the file, detectives had to make another decision. They had to ask whether the man described by scattered witnesses in earlier cases was truly one man at all. That was not a glamorous question. It was a disciplined one. Cities produce resemblance by accident. Many men in Glasgow in the late 1960s were of similar age, wore similar suits, drank in similar places, and went dancing under the same lights. If police were going to tell themselves they were hunting a single offender, they needed more than a feeling. So they began to compare descriptions with a stricter eye. Height was noted, build was noted, hair color, hairstyle, and the line of the jaw were noted. So were clothes. A neat suit, perhaps, or a smart manner of dress that made the man seem tidy and self-possessed. Each witness remembered only a portion. Taken alone, none of it was enough. Taken together, it began to form a recurring outline. He was said to be polite. That word appears often in recollections from this case. Not charming in an extravagant sense. Not loud, simply polite. The kind of man who spoke easily, who did not seem out of place, who could move through an evening without causing alarm. That detail helps explain why the investigation became so patient. A man who frightens people leaves one kind of memory. A man who seems ordinary, even considerate, leaves another. People do not study him as closely. They remember him later, and only in pieces. By now, detectives were building not just a suspect profile, but a rhythm. They wanted to know when this man appeared. Did he arrive alone? Did he drink heavily, or only enough to seem sociable? Did he dance often, or mostly talk? Did he choose women who were alone, or those separated briefly from friends? These are the practical questions that occupy long evenings in a police office. Not the dramatic question of who, just yet. First, the quieter one, how. As these comparisons deepened, another development took shape. The Barrowland was a famous place, but famous places also create problems for memory. On a busy night, there are too many faces. Music is loud, lighting changes what people notice. By the time officers returned to ask careful questions, many witnesses were trying to recall a specific man from among dozens they may have passed only once. That did not stop the inquiry. It simply changed its methods. Police began sorting memories by reliability, who had spoken directly with the man, who had only seen him from a distance, who remembered his words, and who remembered only his clothing. This was another decision point, and an important one. The case could drift into rumor, or it could stay grounded in the most dependable accounts. Investigators chose the second path. That meant some stories, however vivid, had to be set aside. It meant favoring the witness who could place herself near the suspect for a long stretch of time over the person who thought he looked familiar in passing. It meant accepting that good detective work is often an act of subtraction. You remove what cannot be trusted, and what remains, even if small, becomes valuable. Meanwhile, there was Glasgow itself to consider. This was not a puzzle happening in an empty landscape. It unfolded through tenements, bus stops, pubs, dance halls, and the practical geography of getting home late at night. A man comfortable in that geography would know when streets emptied, where taxis could be found, which neighborhoods were quiet after closing time. He might know how to leave a busy area without attracting notice. He might also know the habits of women who danced at the Barrowland, where they came from, whether they usually traveled alone, and what happened after the hall closed. That possibility pushed the investigation outward. The ballroom doors were one part of the story, the roads leading away from them were another. Officers began tracing likely routes, not with the confidence of modern surveillance, because there was none, but with maps, memory, and transport schedules. If a woman left at a certain hour, what buses were still running? If she took a taxi, where might it have turned? If she was seen walking, how far could she reasonably have gone before the next reliable sighting? These questions sound modest. They are. But in a case built from fragments, modest questions do the heavy work. The detectives were learning that the suspect, whoever he was, moved through ordinary systems. Public transport, footpaths, taxi ranks, crowded exits. Nothing exotic. That made him harder, not easier, to identify. He did not stand apart from the city. He used it. And because he used it so naturally, the inquiry had to understand the city just as naturally. There was also the matter of timing. The three cases did not happen in quick succession. There was a gap between the first and second, then only a few months between the second and third. That irregularity could suggest many things. Perhaps the suspect's work changed. Perhaps he left Glasgow for periods of time. Perhaps the first case had not been recognized properly at the time, delaying the pattern. Or perhaps, in the hardest possibility of all, there were other incidents that had never been connected, never reported in the right way, or never entered the file at all. Detectives could not assume, so they searched backwards as well as forwards. They reviewed older reports. They asked whether there were other women whose final known movements touched the same social circle of dance halls and late-night travel. Most of these checks led nowhere. That too is part of patient investigation. You do not only follow what glows, you also clear the dark corners one by one. As autumn deepened in 1969, the pressure on the case changed. It was no longer a matter of solving an isolated killing. Police were now confronting the possibility that a serial offender had been moving through familiar public spaces. That realization altered the mood of the inquiry. More resources were committed, more interviews were ordered. Descriptions were circulated more widely. The city began to understand that the person being sought was not a phantom from a single night, but someone who might still be living a routine life, working, traveling, speaking politely, and blending into the week between weekends. That possibility always gives an old case its peculiar stillness. The suspect is not imagined as a monster in hiding. He is imagined standing in an ordinary queue, taking a bus, returning home, saying very little. The ordinary becomes difficult to trust, and so the work became broader. Taxi drivers were asked what they remembered. That may sound like a small detail, but taxi memory can be unexpectedly precise. Drivers remember fares that feel unusual, routes taken at odd hours, the look of a passenger in the rear mirror, the way two people spoke to one another when they thought nobody was listening. In this case, those recollections mattered because the suspect did not seem hurried. He seemed comfortable enough to move from public place to public place. That suggested confidence. Confidence suggested familiarity. And familiarity suggested he was local, or local enough. Bus conductors were also considered. So were nearby publicans, attendants, and neighbors who might have heard a gate, a voice, or footsteps at an hour when the street had mostly gone quiet. Every such inquiry was a wager against forgetfulness. Ask too late, and memory softens. Ask carefully enough, and some details remain. One witness might remember a man's suit, another, his speech. A third, the fact that he called someone by name or asked a question in a manner that seemed formal. Individually, these things are thin. Together, they can begin to carry weight. The investigation was now doing what complex cases often do. It was shifting from event to behavior. Not simply what happened, but how the unknown man conducted himself. Did he speak with ease to women he had just met? Did he present himself as reliable? Did he volunteer personal details, true or false, to seem established and safe? Did he offer opinions that made him memorable after the fact? Those questions became more urgent because of one surviving witness, the person who had spent the longest time near the suspect and who would soon shape the public image of the entire case. Before her account was fully fixed, though, detectives had to prepare for the strain that public attention would bring. Once a city receives a face, even an unfinished face, it starts to see that face everywhere. So officers began working with artists on composite sketches based on available descriptions. This was a practical step, but also a dangerous one. A composite can focus an investigation. It can also distort it. People begin adjusting their memories to match the drawing. Names are suggested too quickly. Tips multiply, and many of them cancel one another out. Still, police had little choice. Without a face, the suspect remained too abstract. With one, however uncertain, the public might help. That was the reasoning. And reasoning, in an old case, is often all you have. The earliest circulated impressions described a man in his 20s or 30s, well-spoken, neatly dressed, with reddish or light brown hair in some recollections, and strong, regular features that several witnesses found easy to describe but impossible to place. He was not remembered as rough. That kept returning. He was not remembered as disordered, he was remembered as composed. That composure may be one reason he lingered so strongly in the minds of those who encountered him. A person who behaves out of place is forgotten one way. A person who behaves exactly as expected while saying one or two slightly unusual things is often remembered with an odd clarity. And there was already a hint of that. Unusual remarks, moral observations, a way of speaking about drink and conduct that felt distinct from ordinary ballroom conversation. At first, these were only scattered impressions. Soon they would become central. But for that to happen, detectives needed the fullest account available. That brought them to Jean Langford. She was Helen Puttock's sister. On the night of the 31st of October, she had gone with Helen to the Barrowland. At some point in the evening, they met two men. One gave a name that has never settled cleanly in the record. The other would become the figure later known to the public as Bible John. The decision to center Jean's recollection was unavoidable. She had not merely glimpsed the suspect across a room, she had spoken with him. She had shared part of the evening in his company. She had been in the taxi with him and her sister as the night wound down. In a case starving for certainty, that kind of witness becomes both precious and burdensome. Precious because she offers detail. Burdensome because the entire case can begin to lean too heavily on one memory. Detectives knew this, so they approached her account with both urgency and caution. They needed everything she could remember. What he wore, how he sat, what sort of accent he had, whether his teeth stood out, whether he seemed educated, whether he drank freely or held back. Small things. Always small things. Jean could remember that he talked more than the other man, and that his talking had a curious shape to it. He did not speak like someone trying too hard to impress. He spoke as if he expected to be listened to. That difference mattered. A man who performs is often easy to spot later. A man who speaks with plain certainty can be harder to hold in memory because certainty feels ordinary until it does not. She remembered him as neatly dressed, in a way that fit the room. Nothing theatrical. A suit well kept. A presentation that suggested care and perhaps habit. He did not seem adrift in the ballroom. He seemed to know how to stand in it. That impression became one of the first strong lines in the police portrait. He could enter a social place and seem entirely normal there. He could approach two sisters on a night out and not cause immediate concern. He could keep company for long enough that conversation, not appearance alone, became the real evidence. And conversation is both a gift and a problem. It gives detail. It also depends on memory, on the strange way a sentence can stay in the mind while a face softens around it. Jean recalled remarks about religion, and about drink, and about the conduct of married women. These comments were unusual enough to remain, not because they were shouted, quite the opposite. They seemed to have been spoken in the calm tone of a man giving his opinion, as if it were settled fact. That is often how certain phrases survive. Not dramatic words, just words said with enough firmness that they feel slightly colder in retrospect. When police heard that account, they understood at once that these details might help the public recognize the suspect. They also understood the danger if they released too much. False memories would begin to gather around the case. Men all across the city might suddenly be remembered quoting scripture, or criticizing drink, or speaking in some severe manner after an evening dance. The line between a useful public description and a citywide mirage is very thin. So the next stage of the inquiry became a matter of selection. What should be kept close inside the file, and what should be sent outward into Glasgow? That is one of the quieter disciplines of police work. Not every detail is shared, even when a case is urgent. Some facts are held back to test future statements. If a man confesses and gives only what the newspapers already carried, that is one kind of confession. If he knows what was never printed, that is another. In this case, that caution would shape the file for years. Still, enough emerged that the suspect acquired a public identity. Newspapers fastened onto the religious element, the name that settled in the public imagination, the one that would never quite leave, was not chosen because detectives had solved anything. It was chosen because it gave the city a way to talk about a man who remained unknown. Bible John, a phrase both specific and empty. Specific enough to remember, empty enough to fit too many possibilities. The name helped the investigation at first. People remember a title more easily than a composite of traits. A well-dressed man in his 20s or 30s could be anybody. A man who spoke in stern or scriptural ways seemed more distinct. Tips began to flow in. Some came from women who thought they had danced with such a man. Some came from families who found the description uncomfortably close to a brother, a cousin, a former husband. Some came from co-workers who remembered someone with strong opinions, neat habits, and a face not unlike the sketch. A police inquiry grows heavier this way, not by one breakthrough, but by accumulation. Letters, telephone calls, names on scraps of paper, addresses copied into notebooks. Each one had to be weighed. Each one had to be checked against geography, age, employment, known movements, and whatever could still be proved about where a man had been on a particular night. That checking took time, and time changed the witness material even as detectives used it. The more often a description is repeated, the more fixed it seems. Yet fixed descriptions can hide their own weakness. A face remembered after one evening becomes a story told many times. Each telling smooths it, each question asked by police can sharpen one feature and dim another. That was especially true with composite sketches. Artists worked from what witnesses could provide, but a drawing is a negotiation between memory and suggestion. A witness says the nose seemed longer, the hair perhaps fairer, the jaw may be broader. The artist adjusts. The detective watches. Another witness is shown the result and agrees with part of it, then doubts the mouth, then says the eyes are not right. None of this means the process is useless. It means it is fragile. In the Bible John case, that fragility would haunt almost every later theory. Because once a sketch enters public life, people do not only remember the man, they remember the drawing. And later, when a suspect is suggested, they compare him not to the night itself, but to the image printed in papers and stored in memory. Even so, police had to proceed. Jean's account gave them far more than a general impression. It suggested habits. He seemed sober, or at least careful. He was noticed speaking critically about drinking, which struck people because the setting itself was social and relaxed. He reportedly gave the impression of someone who observed boundaries, at least in his own mind. He may have spoken of family in a way that sounded respectable. There were mentions, in some versions of the account, of a military background, or references that made detectives wonder about national service, discipline, or training. That did not establish fact, but it opened lines of inquiry. If the man had served in the military, records might help. If he was deeply religious, church communities might recognize him. If he was in steady work, his schedule might explain the gaps between incidents. Investigators now had something they had not possessed before. Not a name, but a social outline. That is different from a physical one. A physical outline says what a man looked like. A social outline says how he moved through the world. Neat in dress, controlled in manner, conversational, possibly moralizing. At ease with dance hall culture, yet seeming apart from its easy indulgence. That mixture intrigued detectives, because it seemed slightly contradictory. A man who disapproved of drink and certain behavior, yet chose to spend evenings in places where drink and flirtation were ordinary parts of the scene. Why would such a man be there? That question sounds psychological, but it is also practical. Where a suspect feels comfortable tells you where else he may go. Police began widening their search through institutions as well as streets. Church connections were explored, not in a dramatic sweep through all of Glasgow's congregations, but in the slow, realistic way such things are done. Ministers were asked discreet questions. Congregants with relevant age and appearance were considered. It was not enough that a man attended church. He had to fit the witness account, the timing, the routes, the age, the general pattern. Very few did, and those who looked promising at first often weakened under ordinary fact. Too young, too old, living too far away without easy transport, working night shifts that could be documented, married men accounted for by family, single men who resembled the sketch but had no connection to the city at the right times. Each elimination made the remaining uncertainty feel a little sharper. Police also considered whether the suspect was exaggerating or inventing the religious aspect entirely. A man may present himself in a certain way because it creates trust or because it gives him an identity that stands out. He may talk about church without belonging to one. He may quote or paraphrase scripture without being devout. He may simply know that sounding moral makes him seem safer than sounding reckless. That possibility kept the inquiry from narrowing too fast. Good investigators are often cautious about details that appear too distinctive. Distinctive details can guide. They can also mislead, so the case file expanded in two directions at once. In one direction, detectives pursued the memorable portrait the witness had given. In the other, they protected themselves against becoming captive to it. That balance was difficult to maintain, especially under public pressure. By now, the city wanted a face and a story. Papers printed the sketch. Rumors attached themselves to ordinary men. Dance hall memories were retold in workplaces and kitchens. Women discussed whether they had seen him. Men wondered whether someone at the office, or on a route, or in a local pub might fit. The suspect became both highly visible and strangely impossible to find. That is one of the odd effects of a famous unsolved case. Recognition spreads faster than proof. The police, meanwhile, kept returning to movement. How had the suspect entered and left those evenings? What did his route tell them? The taxi ride after Helen Puttock's evening became especially important because it preserved sequence. A dance hall encounter is broad and noisy. A taxi narrows the world. It places a few people in a small moving space, and that can create clearer memory. Jean's recollection of the ride and of the way the men left it gave police practical anchors. Who got out where, which directions were taken, how the conversation changed as the journey continued. A taxi driver might remember some of this. A passenger certainly might, if the company had lasted long enough. And so officers worked carefully through what could be reconstructed. The two sisters had met the two men at the Barrowland. At closing time or near it, they shared a taxi. One man left first. Then the route continued with the other man, the one later labeled Bible John, still present. In such a sequence, every stop becomes significant, not because it proves identity, but because it marks the suspect as someone willing to remain in company beyond the bright public part of the evening. He was not merely a face at the ballroom, he was part of the journey home. That suggested confidence of a different kind. It also gave detectives a reason to study transport habits with greater care. If the suspect left the taxi at a certain point, where might he have gone next? If he walked, how far? If he was picked up by someone, who would be awake to see it? If he lived nearby, what streets or closes offered quiet access after midnight? Maps began to matter more than before. Investigators compared likely routes with addresses of men who came under suspicion. They examined whether a plausible suspect could have reached the ballroom easily, left it with equal ease, and returned home without attracting attention. This was slower work than the public probably imagined. There was no single citywide sweep that would reveal the answer. There were route cards, street directories, employment files, handwritten notes about bus times and neighborhoods. There were officers who knew parts of Glasgow intimately, and others who had to learn them from paper. A city is different at 1:30 in the morning than at 1:30 in the afternoon. The inquiry had to understand the night city, the practical city, the one built from exhausted workers, dance hall regulars, final buses and taxi fares paid in careful coins. In trying to trace those journeys, police also revisited the earlier cases through this same lens. Patricia Docker's evening had always suffered from uncertainty at the front end. If she had told family one destination but gone to another, then reconstructing her night depended on indirect evidence and witness recollection rather than a clean chain. That made the comparison harder. Yet detectives now had a stronger model for what they were looking for. A man who could meet a woman in or near a dance hall setting. A man who could speak normally and gain trust. A man who could move into the journey home without seeming out of place. With that model in mind, older statements were read again. A sentence that once looked ordinary could take on new meaning. A remembered companion once described only as smartly dressed could now be compared to Jean's more developed portrait. Jemima MacDonald's case also returned to the center of analysis. Here, too, the Barrowland connection was significant. Not because every detail matched meekly, but because the social setting did. Police are often wary of making one case fit another by force. The right question is not whether two files can be made to resemble each other. The right question is whether they still resemble each other after the doubtful details are stripped away. In these killings, enough remained. Late-night movement. The dance hall environment. A male companion recalled but not identified. A narrow geography of opportunity. That was enough to keep the files joined. And once joined, they demanded a larger suspect search than any one case might have generated on its own. The scale of that search becomes easier to understand if you imagine the number of men who could superficially fit 20s to 30s, local or local enough, socially competent, neat in dress, able to be out late without immediate scrutiny, possibly unmarried, or at least not tightly bound by household observation, possibly employed in work that gave some freedom or irregular shifts, possibly religious or able to sound that way. This is a wide net. To narrow it, detectives needed more than description. They needed exclusion. Exclusion is the quiet engine of cold case work. You cannot prove every man innocent in some grand sense. You simply establish, one after another, why this one does not fit, why that one was elsewhere, why another only resembles the sketch. And that can take years. At the time, however, they still hoped for something more immediate. Publicity could produce recognition. A relative might see the sketch and feel a private shock. A former girlfriend might connect the moralizing talk with an old memory. A co-worker might notice that someone had been absent or acting unusually around the dates in question. So appeals continued. Descriptions circulated. Police interviewed and re-interviewed. Women who had attended the Barrowland were asked whether they had danced with a man who spoke in this unusual way. Again, many thought they had. Very few could bring anything that could be tested. This is where a famous suspect image can begin to consume a case. Almost every memory starts bending toward it. Investigators had to protect themselves from that drift. One method was to prioritize statements taken closest in time to the events. Another was to separate witnesses from press coverage whenever possible. If someone came forward after reading a detailed article, what did they truly remember from the night and what had they absorbed later? Such questions are not cynical, they are necessary. A witness can be honest and still mistaken. Honesty is not the same as accuracy. Jean's account remained the strongest because of duration and proximity. She had sat with the man. He had spoken at length. She could report not just features but manner. Manner is often more durable than exact appearance. A person may forget the width of a nose. They may not forget the way a man answered a question or the little pause before he judged someone else's behavior. That said, even strong witnesses are not perfect. Police knew that stress could alter recall. So could grief. So could the simple process of being interviewed repeatedly. Every interview clarifies some things and hardens others. Sometimes what hardens is wrong. This is why detectives compared her statements carefully over time, not because they doubted her sincerity, but because they needed to understand which details remained stable. Those stable details became the backbone of the working portrait. The suspect was generally placed in his 20s or early 30s. He was thought to be around average to above average height, with a slim or athletic build depending on the account. Reddish hair, or light brown with warmth in it, appeared often enough to matter. The teeth were discussed, perhaps because they were noticeable when he spoke or smiled. He sounded local to some ears, but not strongly marked by one district. That too can matter. A man whose accent is moderate is harder to place geographically. He belongs everywhere and nowhere. It was also said in some recollections that he danced in an old-fashioned or formal style. Whether that detail was truly significant is difficult to know, but detectives considered it because style can reflect age, upbringing, or social habit. A man dancing more formally than others might come from a stricter home, might simply be reserved, or might be consciously managing his image. None of those possibilities could be tested directly. Still, they colored the inquiry. As names came in, officers asked not only whether a suspect looked right, but whether his habits aligned with the portrait. Did he move in dance hall circles? Did women describe him as controlled or judgmental? Did he speak of religion often? Had he ever made people uneasy not by aggression but by a certain rigid politeness? The work widened further into records. Employment records, military records, criminal records, though those offered less than some might assume. If the suspect had no prior serious convictions, he would not stand out there. Still, police checked. A man with offences involving women, with violence, or with nighttime movement around the city would naturally draw attention. But here again the case taught patience. A plausible criminal history might tempt investigators to settle too quickly. Many men had records. Only a very small number fit the geography, age, appearance, and witness material together. The reverse was also true. A man might fit the sketch almost perfectly and have no record at all. That possibility had to remain open. In an unsolved case, the most unsettling answer is often the quietest one. The offender may never have come to police attention for anything else. He may have lived a life outwardly steady enough that suspicion never gathered around him in an official way. By the early 1970s, the inquiry had developed a layered structure. At the center sat the linked files and the witness portrait. Around them sat transport reconstruction, geography, and public tips. Beyond that lay institutional checks, church communities, employment routes, military possibilities, and endless elimination. This is what it means for a case to stop being an event and become a system. It no longer belongs only to one night. It belongs to decades of record keeping. The detective assigned this month inherits the notes of the detective from last year, who inherited the questions of the detective from the year before. In that sense, the case had already begun its long second life. Yet there was still a hope, in those earlier years, that a decisive identification might be made by witness recognition. Police arranged viewings of men who had come to attention. Photographs were compared. Potential suspects were measured against the composite and against Jean's recollections. Sometimes a man seemed promising from one angle, then failed completely from another. Too broad in the face, too heavy in build, wrong speech, wrong age by several years, wrong movements on the night. There is a kind of disappointment unique to this stage of an investigation. For a few hours, or a few days, a name seems to gather force. Papers are pulled, addresses checked, old employers contacted, family members quietly approached. Then one sheet in the file places him elsewhere, or a witness says no, not him, not the eyes, not the voice. And the case settles back into uncertainty. This happened more than once. It would happen many times over the years. What made the Bible John inquiry especially difficult was that the suspect, as described, was not bizarre enough to stand alone. He was memorable, yes, but not in a way that reduced the field to a handful. There were many careful men in Glasgow, many polite men, many men raised in homes where religion was spoken of, often whether gently or sternly. Many men who wore suits to dance halls and watched their drink. The suspect was specific in outline, but broad in social type. That is a hard combination. The public image fixed by the name Bible John gave the illusion of uniqueness. The police file knew better. It knew how many near matches could emerge from a city. It knew how often one detail would fit and another would not. As the case expanded, investigators also had to deal with a more private category of information, the names suggested by officers themselves. This matters in many old inquiries. A detective who has walked the city for years carries his own store of local knowledge. He knows the difficult households, the men with troubling reputations not always visible in formal records. Some of those names reached the file only as murmurs, passed from one officer to another, then written down with a question mark beside them. Others arrived with more weight, because a constable had once answered a domestic call at a certain address, or because a man had been remembered as strict, controlling, hard to know, and difficult to place. But even these locally sourced suspicions had to be treated with care. A reputation is not evidence. A difficult temper is not identity. And so the names that came from police intuition entered the same long process as every other name. Addresses were checked, ages were checked, employment was checked, transport was checked. Sometimes that was all it took to move a man out of the picture. At other times, the checking only deepened the uncertainty. A suspect might be the right age, with the right coloring, and still drift beyond proof because no witness could truly place him. This was the pattern of the 1970s. Not one great advance, but the steady rise and fall of possibilities. Each promising name carried its own little weather. For a week or a month, an office might grow quiet around it. Men would pull older reports. A detective would read back through statements with fresh eyes. Someone would drive to a former workplace. Someone else would ask, discreetly, whether the man had ever been known to go dancing in the East End. Then the answer would come back incomplete, or too late, or not strong enough. And the name would slide into the long shelf of Nearly. That shelf grows very large in a cold case. By now, the witness material had become both indispensable and heavy. Jean Langford's account still anchored the inquiry more than any other single source. Her memory of the man's appearance, his manner, his conversation, and the taxi journey could not simply be replaced by another theory. At the same time, detectives understood the burden of relying so much on one witness, so they kept returning to an old discipline, comparison by independent points. If a suspect came forward in rumor, could anything about him be tested apart from resemblance? Did his known movements make sense? Did he have access to the right districts? Did his age align? Did anyone else remember him in dance hall settings? This kind of checking lacks drama, but it is the closest thing an old investigation has to solid ground. Without it, the case would have dissolved into guesswork. Public memory, meanwhile, was doing what public memory often does. It was preserving the broadest image and losing the cautions attached to it. The city remembered the sketch. The city remembered the phrase, Bible John. The city remembered the idea of a well-dressed man with strong opinions about religion and drink. What the city did not always remember was how carefully that portrait had been assembled, and how vulnerable every witness account remains to time, repetition, and retelling. That gap between public certainty and police caution widened over the years. Newspaper coverage helped keep the case alive. It also froze certain details in place. A drawing printed often enough starts to feel like a photograph. A reported remark begins to sound like a verified trait. And a suspect nickname becomes a kind of identity, even though the man beneath it is still unknown. So investigators had to work inside two versions of the case. One was the public case, vivid and recognizable. The other was the file room case, layered with doubt, qualifiers, and things that could not yet be said firmly. That split matters because it affected every later suspect. When someone was proposed by journalists, by relatives, or by retired officers, he was usually measured first against the public version. Did he look like the composite? Did he seem religious? Did he fit the broad age range? Only afterward came the slower, less visible testing against the full record. And that fuller record often changed the picture. A man could resemble the sketch closely, yet fail on movement, timing, or witness detail. Another might fit the geography well, yet look wrong to those who had seen the suspect. The file was not asking for a rough likeness. It was asking for a convergence. Convergence is rare. As the 1970s wore on, the investigation absorbed another familiar burden of major unsolved cases: letters. Some came from members of the public who believed they knew the answer. Some came from men writing strange or self-important things. Some hinted at confessions without ever becoming usable confessions. Others named neighbors, former friends, brothers, husbands, or men who had vanished from a certain circle at just the wrong time. Every one of these had to be opened, logged, considered, and often answered. That paperwork can fill more space than evidence itself. A cold case is not only facts, it is also administration, envelopes, index cards, typed summaries, cross-references, notes pinned to older notes. A large part of detective patience is simply the willingness to keep order where uncertainty would prefer chaos. And there were also tips from families. Families remember habits that police files do not. A sister may recall how a brother spoke about women. A former wife may remember that he always polished his shoes before going out dancing. A cousin may have heard him use a phrase that appears in witness material years later. These details can be useful. They can also be shaped by fear, guilt, or the pressure of living near a famous case. So detectives had to ask difficult, quiet questions. When did you first think of him? Before the newspapers said this, or after? Did he attend the Barrowland regularly, or is that being assumed now? Can anyone else support what you're saying? Each answer either strengthened the paper trail or left it thin. By then, the names under review were not all of the same type. Some were men with criminal histories, some were respectable men with no official record but troubling private reputations. Some were former soldiers or men said to have served. Some were linked to strict religious households. Some simply looked like the drawing in a way that made people uneasy. The detectives had to resist the pull of narrative. It is easy, when tired, to favor the suspect who seems to complete the story. The rigid man from a hard family, the ex-serviceman who moved quietly, the churchgoer with a temper, the loner who lived alone and kept odd hours. All of these possibilities fit some version of the public imagination. The file asked for more. It asked whether the same man could be tied, by real and checkable means, to the right streets, the right times, and the right habits. Often, the answer was no. There were men who looked right, but lived wrong. Men who lived right, but sounded wrong. Men whose character alarmed people, but whose age or location ruled them out. This may be the least satisfying part of any old case, but it is also the most honest. Most suspects do not fade because they are proven innocent in some complete moral sense. They fade because the case cannot hold them steadily enough. And when that happened, detectives moved on, sometimes to the next promising name, sometimes back to the old maps, Sometimes to the witness statements again, reading them as if a new answer might quietly rise from the same old words. That repeated reading is not wasted effort. A file changes when the reader changes. A young detective may notice the broad strokes, an older one may notice what was not said, or what was asked too quickly, or which assumptions shaped the original inquiry. In long investigations, each generation of officers inherits not just evidence, but the habits of thought that came with it. Some inherit narrowness, some inherit caution, some inherit a suspect preferred by a former superior, and sometimes a new detective does the most useful thing possible. He distrusts what everyone has grown comfortable believing. That kind of quiet rereading would become more important as the decades passed. But first, the case had to survive its own middle years. That meant keeping it active enough to absorb new information without pretending that momentum still existed in the way it had in late 1969. This is where many cases begin to cool into routine. There is no daily development, no constant press conference. Instead, there are periodic reviews. An old lead reopened because a witness died and left a letter. A name checked again because an officer from another division remembered something. A former suspect revisited because he had changed address, or died, or come up in another inquiry. The Bible John investigation entered that rhythm, and with it came the strange relationship between police work and civic memory. Glasgow did not forget the Barrowland murders. The city carried them. In kitchens, in pubs, in older conversations about the East End after dark, the sketch and the name remained. That public memory helped keep pressure on the case. It also ensured the rumor never truly settled. A famous unsolved case gathers private theories the way old buildings gather soot. Every family seems to know someone who once knew someone. Every retired officer has a man he thought deserved more scrutiny. Every journalist hears a version that sounds close enough to print, and every such theory enters the larger cloud around the file. Some of those theories centered on men who had already been looked at. That is another feature of cold cases. A suspect is rarely checked only once. If his name returns often enough, if his resemblance is strong enough, or if later crimes make him seem more plausible, the file circles back. Detectives compare the old findings with the new suggestion. They ask whether the earlier elimination was sound. They ask what standards were used. They ask whether something that could not be tested then can be tested now. This did not produce an immediate answer in the Bible John case, but it kept the case from hardening completely into legend. It remained, at least within police work, a live set of questions. Some proposed suspects became almost famous in their own right. Their names circulated privately for years before becoming public in any meaningful way. What made them persuasive was seldom one thing. Usually it was a collection of partial fits, a resemblance to the drawing, a local connection, a difficult history with women, an intensity about religion, a habit of vanishing at night. Yet the closer the file examined such men, the more it returned to the same obstacle. Partial fit is not enough. The problem with a strong composite and a famous nickname is that both encourage partial fitting. People fill gaps. They do it naturally. A man who is stern becomes scriptural. A man who is neat becomes the well-dressed stranger. A man who once attended the Barrowland becomes a likely presence on the crucial nights. Detectives had to work against that human habit. One of the most important practical tasks was to compare names against records that did not care about storytelling. Payroll records, service records, vehicle ownership, address histories, arrest logs, hospital admissions, marriage records, electoral information. Each of these can seem dry on its own. Together, they can quietly undo a theory. A suspect may appear promising until a work ledger shows he was on shift miles away. A relative may insist he lived near the East End, but the address history places him elsewhere. A former partner may describe him as deeply religious, while the rest of the record suggests the performance of religiosity, not settled devotion. These contradictions matter. They are not glamorous, but they save the case from imagination. Through all of this, Another question lingered under the surface. Had police built the suspect image too tightly around one account? If Jean Langford had spent the longest time near the man, then her recollection naturally deserved weight. But what if some details she remembered vividly were incidental, and others less vividly recalled were more important? What if later investigators had mistaken memorability for centrality? This is a difficult thought for any inquiry, because it asks officers to question their strongest material. Still, some did. Quietly, and often years later, they wondered whether the image known to the public had narrowed the search too much. Perhaps the suspect was not as conventionally attractive or polished as the drawing suggested. Perhaps his religious remarks were less central than the newspapers made them. Perhaps the name Bible John had become both useful and distorting. These were not acts of rejection, they were acts of maintenance. A good cold case review does not worship its old assumptions. It examines them. That became more urgent as the file aged. Paper changes with time, ink fades, indexes become inconsistent, officers retire, informal knowledge leaves the building. A detective who once knew exactly why a suspect was downgraded may no longer be there to explain it. If those reasons were poorly noted, the next generation inherits not clarity, but shadows. So part of the work in the long years was simply preserving coherence, making sure the case could still be read, making sure its layers remained visible. Which witness said what? Which names had been checked? Which alibis were verified? And how? Which lines of inquiry had failed because they were weak? And which had failed only because the tools of the time were limited? That distinction would matter later, because eventually the case would enter a period when old evidence could be asked new questions. Before that happened, however, the suspect field continued to broaden and contract in uneven ways. There were men linked by press speculation, men linked by family suspicion, men linked by police instinct, and then there were men linked by later criminal histories. This last category often pulls public attention strongly. If a man later commits serious crimes, or is convicted in another case, people naturally ask whether he should be connected backward to an unsolved one. Sometimes that instinct is right. Sometimes it is only the mind's desire for economy, for one bad man to explain many bad things. Investigators had to be especially disciplined here. They could not simply take a known violent offender from the wider region and fold him into the Barrowland file because it felt plausible. He still had to match the practical structure of the case. Age, appearance, access, behavior in social settings, relationship to the city, whether witnesses could recognize him or exclude him. This produced recurring disappointment. Men who looked dangerous in hindsight often looked weak on paper in relation to the actual file, and men who looked steady, even ordinary, remained difficult because they fit too many of the case's softer edges. By the 1980s, the inquiry belonged as much to persistence as to active hope. That sounds bleak, but it is not entirely so. Persistence is one of the most humane qualities in detective work. It means the file is not abandoned simply because it has become difficult. It means officers continue to carry the names of the dead, continue to test the stories, continue to protect the possibility that one day an overlooked connection may still matter. The Barrowland murders stayed in that protected category. They were not solved. They were not forgotten. And because they were not forgotten, they continued to attract both genuine new information and fresh waves of confusion. Retired officers sometimes spoke more openly than serving ones about the names that had troubled them most. A journalist might hear such a name and begin tracing it. A family might see a newspaper article and decide to come forward after years of silence. That process could be useful. It could also turn speculation into something that looked firmer than it was. The distance between insider suspicion and public accusation is not small. Yet in old cases, it is often crossed. And once crossed, it changes the atmosphere. A named suspect alters the rhythm of the file. Instead of asking broadly who the man might have been, everyone asks whether it was this particular man. The advantage is focus. The danger is tunnel vision. The Bible John case would eventually see several such shifts. Some names gathered attention because they had been discussed for years inside police circles, others because they emerged through books, documentaries, or renewed press campaigns. Each time, the same process had to begin again. Take the claim, strip it down, check the records, compare to witnesses, measure against the preserved evidence. Then decide whether the suspect had genuinely moved closer to the center or had only returned because his story was emotionally satisfying. This is where cold case work can feel almost monastic. A city is eager, the media is eager, families are understandably eager. But the file asks for slowness. It asks for the ability to sit with uncertainty longer than most people find comfortable. Not because uncertainty is noble, but because haste in an old case usually gives you nothing that lasts. All the while, the old evidence itself waited. That is worth pausing over. Evidence in a cold case does not simply sleep. It ages. It changes condition. It may be lost, mislabeled, damaged, or preserved with surprising care, depending on the habits of the original inquiry. A swab, an envelope, a clothing item, a hair sample, a handwritten note of chain of custody, any of these can become crucial decades later, or useless if handled poorly. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, detectives could not fully know what future forensic science would ask of their storage methods, but they still had to label, seal, and keep. Some did this better than others, and the Bible John case, like many old investigations, carried both the strengths and weaknesses of its era. By the time later reviews began to think seriously about scientific re-examination, officers had to answer practical questions before they could answer evidential ones. What still existed, what had been retained properly, what had passed through too many hands, which exhibits had clear provenance, and which were now uncertain. You cannot test what you cannot trust. So even the move towards science began, fittingly, with paperwork. The surviving case file had to be reconciled with the surviving property stores. Descriptions of exhibits had to match physical reality. Dates had to align. Seals had to be examined. Labels had to be read against old logs. This may sound almost clerical. It is. But clerical work can decide the future of a murder case. If a sample cannot be shown to be what the file says it is, then its value falls sharply. That later phase was still ahead. For now, the case remained in the long corridor between memory and proof. Witnesses aged. Some died. The ballroom itself changed with time, as cities do. The Glasgow of the late 1960s was no longer present except in recollection, records, and the physical layout that still echoed beneath later decades. Yet, the geography continued to matter. Investigators revisiting the file often returned to maps because maps offered one of the few stable things in a case otherwise altered by time. Roads changed less than memory. Distances remained. Walking times could still be estimated. Taxi routes could still be understood in broad form. A suspect's old address could still be pinned against likely movement. These were modest anchors, but they were anchors. And then there was the question of whether the linked pattern itself remained beyond challenge. Most investigators accepted the three murders as linked. The similarities were strong enough, and the Barrowland connection too persistent to make the combined inquiry sensible. Still, serious police work must occasionally retest even its basic architecture. Were all three truly connected? Was Patricia Docker's first evening too uncertain in its reconstruction? Had later confidence in the Barrowland link grown stronger than the earliest evidence justified? These were not comfortable questions, because separating one case could unsettle the logic of the whole. Yet they had to be considered, and when reviewed carefully, the pattern still held enough force to remain intact. Not perfect force, not mathematical certainty, but enough to justify the long-standing view that one offender was responsible. That mattered because if the cases remained linked, then any future forensic development in one might affect the others. A single old sample, if preserved, could shift the weight of decades. That possibility gave later investigators a different kind of patience. Earlier detectives had worked largely with human memory. Later ones began to hope for material memory, the traces objects hold when people cannot. This did not mean science would solve everything. Far from it. Old evidence can disappoint, samples degrade, profiles emerge only in fragments, contamination becomes a risk. And even a strong result may only exclude one suspect rather than identify another. Still, the horizon changed. The case was no longer limited to what Glasgow had remembered in 1969. It could begin asking what the exhibits themselves still knew. That shift, however, did not arrive all at once. What arrived first was not a single answer, but a new standard for asking questions. Old exhibits, once stored mainly as reminders of work already done, became potential witnesses in their own right. That changed the tone of the inquiry. A detective reopening the Barrowland file in a later decade was no longer relying only on recollection, resemblance, and rumor. He could ask whether preserved material might exclude men who had hovered around the case for years. He could also ask whether the famous public image of the suspect had caused the investigation to walk past other possibilities. This was not a dramatic reopening with bright lights and a sudden confession. It was quieter than that. A review team would sit with inventories, continuity notes, and aging labels. They would compare what the paper said should exist with what actually remained in storage. That sort of reconciliation can take a very long time. One property register may call an item by one description. A later review may use another. An envelope may still be present, but the notation on it may not perfectly match a typed summary made years after the fact. Before any science can help, the case has to become legible again. So legibility became part of the work. Detectives and forensic staff looked again at retained clothing, biological traces where any had survived, and the documentary chain around those items. Some exhibits had been preserved more carefully than others. That was true in almost every case from the period. No one in 1969 could fully anticipate what later forensic methods would require. Still, the quality of the original storage now mattered enormously. A properly sealed and identified exhibit could carry possibility. A poorly documented one could create only argument. As this forensic phase developed, one of the clearest consequences was not identification, but exclusion. That may sound modest, yet in a case crowded by decades of named suspects, exclusion was deeply important. A man long whispered about could now be compared to material evidence, rather than only to a sketch in a story. If he did not match, the file could finally let go of him with more confidence than before. That had happened in many cold cases elsewhere, and investigators in Scotland understood the value of it. To remove a false center from an inquiry is not failure. It is a form of clearing, and this case needed clearing. By then, several suspects had gathered years of attention around themselves. Some had become almost legendary in discussions of Bible John. A retired detective would mention one. A journalist would elevate another. Families of victims, readers of newspapers, and viewers of later documentaries would hear the same names recur. Each recurrence gave the impression that the circle had narrowed, but the actual file often remained less certain than the public story suggested. Forensic comparison gave police a tool to test that difference. One of the most discussed names to emerge over the years was John Irvin McInnes. His connection to the case became widely known much later, but the roots of that suspicion lay in private police thought and family concern. He was not pulled from nowhere. He had a resemblance that struck some people. He had a background that allowed others to build a theory around him. And he had relatives who reportedly found the old sketch unsettling enough to speak. That combination, family anxiety and physical resemblance, is powerful in any cold case. It creates emotional gravity. It makes a suspect feel close before the paperwork has said very much at all. So when later investigative attention focused on McInnes, it was part of a pattern already familiar in this file. A man seemed to fit enough of the public image to become persuasive. Then police had to ask whether he fit the evidence itself. That required discipline. It also required patience, because by the time some of these comparisons became feasible, the suspect in question might already be dead. That changes an inquiry in subtle ways. A dead suspect cannot be interviewed, observed, or pressed on contradictions. He can only be studied through records, through witness recollection, through the memory of relatives, and through whatever material comparison can still be made. This creates an odd stillness. The suspect is present in the file, but absent from the room. McInnes became, for some observers, the strongest later candidate. For others, he remained one more compelling but incomplete answer. Part of what sustained interest in him was the impression that old officers had privately taken him seriously. Part was the belief that relatives had seen something too close in the composite to ignore, and part was the general human wish, after so many years, for one name to hold. But holding and proving are not the same. That distinction grew clearer as forensic work matured. When biological evidence from the old case was re-examined with later methods, its role was carefully framed. The science could compare. It could eliminate. In the best circumstances, it could strongly associate. But it still had to contend with the limitations of old evidence, uncertain source material, and the fact that a recovered profile might belong to someone present for innocent reasons rather than guilt. A ballroom case is not like a sealed room mystery. People touched objects. Garments passed through many hands. Investigators had to remain exacting about what a result truly meant. This is why cold case science often sounds less triumphant in the file than it does in headlines. Headlines prefer the language of solving. The file prefers thresholds. Can this profile be trusted? Can the exhibit's history be trusted? Was the sample suitable? Was the comparison complete enough to exclude, or only suggest? These questions governed the later Barrowland reviews, and they had a direct effect on suspect theories. When later reporting suggested that DNA evidence had excluded McInnes, the case shifted again, not toward resolution, but away from a suspect many had hoped, or feared, would finally answer it. That exclusion did not mean he was an innocent man in every broader sense. It meant something narrower and more important to the case. It meant the evidential threshold that mattered most had not carried him over. And once that happened, years of public speculation had to be reconsidered. You can feel how difficult that is in an old file. A suspect becomes familiar. People arrange facts around him. Retired officers repeat his name. Writers return to it. Then a scientific comparison says, in effect, not this one, not on the evidence we can presently stand behind. The case does not collapse when that happens, but it exhales. It lets go of something that had become too comfortable. That letting go matters. Without it, an unsolved case can become trapped by its own favorite theory. For the Barrowland murders, modern review forced investigators to be more modest. The famous suspect might not be the correct suspect. The famous witness image might not be the whole image. And the city's most often repeated name might simply be one of several near matches generated by decades of attention. This was not a defeat. It was a correction. At the same time, forensic review renewed respect for the old evidence itself. The preservation of exhibits, however imperfect, was no longer background administration. It was central. A label written in an ordinary hand decades earlier might now determine whether a comparison could be trusted. A property sheet might explain where an item had been, who had handled it, and whether contamination risk could be assessed. The old habits of evidence control, the ones that once looked routine, had become part of the mystery's survival. That is one of the quiet lessons of cold case work. The future often depends on the care taken by people who did not know the future was coming. An officer sealing a package in 1969 was not imagining genetic profiling as it would later exist. He was simply doing his job as he understood it. Yet decades later, the value of that ordinary care could become immense. And when the care had not been enough, that too became visible. Some items could not be used as confidently as later investigators might have wished. Some comparisons remained uncertain because the material did not allow clean interpretation. That uncertainty can be frustrating, but it is also honest. Good forensic review does not pretend that every old sample can be rescued. It marks the limits. Those limits became especially relevant because the Bible John case had always existed in tension between memory and material evidence. The memory side was unusually vivid. The witness account from Jean Langford had given the case its most enduring shape. The material side was more fragile. As science advanced, the inquiry had to ask whether the two sides confirmed each other or whether one had too long overshadowed the other. That question opened another line of reflection inside the investigation. Had the suspect's search, over the years, become too tied to a very particular type of man? Neat, conversational, religious in speech, memorable in old-fashioned manners. If the strongest witness had captured him accurately, then this narrowing was sensible. If not, the nickname Bible John might have become a sort of trap. It may have encouraged officers and the public alike to favor men with overt religious coloring and to neglect others who fit the geography and opportunity better. This did not mean throwing out the witness account. No serious investigator would do that lightly. It meant reading it with renewed humility. A remembered phrase may be accurate. Its importance may still be uncertain. A noticeable feature may be genuine. Its rarity may be exaggerated by hindsight. These are subtle distinctions, but they matter. They mattered more with each passing decade because the living memory of the case was thinning. Retired officers remembered the atmosphere. Some surviving witnesses remembered fragments. Families remembered the long absence of answers. But the case could no longer count on fresh human recall to carry it much further. So the evidence had to be read in a new order. First, what physical material can still be trusted? Then, what does the documentary record say without interpretation? Then, where do the witness accounts align independently? Only after that could suspect theories be layered back on. This is slower than the public likes. It is also stronger. One effect of this method was to reduce the authority of rumor. In earlier decades, rumor had often kept names alive in the margins. A former officer believed a certain man was the one. A family friend claimed someone had once confessed privately. A journalist obtained a story from a relative who had always been afraid to speak. These fragments still mattered, but they no longer sat near the center unless they could be connected to something verifiable. This was a healthy change. It gave the file firmer edges. At the same time, it did not make the mystery any less human. In some ways, it made it more so. The further the case moved from the original events, the clearer it became that much of detective work is an act of care. Care in storage, care in reading. Care in not saying more than the evidence allows. Care in revisiting names that once seemed convincing and now seem less so. And care in refusing to let the file become pure folklore. Because folklore is easy. It gives a city a villain and a sketch and a phrase. A real inquiry must accept that the villain may not look exactly like the folklore at all. This tension appeared again and again in discussions of named suspects. Another man might rise because his face resembled the composite more strongly than the current favorite. Someone else might be discussed because of local connections to dance halls or because of later offending that made him seem possible in retrospect. Retired detectives would sometimes support one theory, then another would emerge from a journalist who had found old notes or spoken to former relatives. Each theory offered the same promise. Perhaps the answer has been here all along, in plain sight, attached to one overlooked name. That promise is powerful. It also tends to repeat itself. The Barrowland file had seen it before. Every strong theory began with convergence in imagination. Then came the harder stage, convergence on paper. And paper is less generous. A man may seem right until his age is off, or until his movements cannot be put near the right place, or until a witness who should recognize him does not, or until the forensic comparison does not support him. One by one, the old favorite suspects had to endure that treatment. Some survived part of it, none survived all of it. This is why the case stayed open. Not because police lacked ideas, because every idea stopped short of legal and evidential certainty. By the time cold case science had become part of the story, another quiet change had also taken place. The Barrowland murders had entered institutional memory. They were no longer only the work of the original detectives. They had become a teaching case in patience, preservation, and caution. New officers learned from them not only because of the suspect's sketch or the public notoriety, but because the file demonstrated how a case can outlive the methods that first built it. A witness statement taken in one era may be reinterpreted in another. A stored exhibit may gain significance decades after its collection. A suspect strongly favored by one generation may be excluded by the next. This is difficult for institutions. Police culture often values confidence. Cold case work teaches modesty. The Bible John inquiry forced that lesson repeatedly. There was also the matter of public expectation. Whenever a review was announced or a documentary revived interest, there was a familiar feeling in the air. Perhaps now. Perhaps the old evidence has finally yielded something decisive. Perhaps the named suspect from years ago can at last be confirmed. These moments of renewed attention can be useful. They prompt fresh tips. They encourage relatives, witnesses, or former acquaintances to revisit what they know. They remind institutions that the case still matters, but they also create a burden. If the review ends not with a solution but with another careful narrowing of possibilities, the public often feels let down. The detectives, by contrast, may feel they have done something substantial. They have removed a false lead, they have stabilized the evidence, they have made the file cleaner for the next person. In long investigations, that is real progress. You can almost imagine the physical file itself growing more orderly as the years pass. Old carbon copies beside later typed summaries, handwritten annotations beside forensic reports with more modern language, names once marked with uncertainty, now marked as excluded, other names still left with a question. This layering is part of the case's character. The Bible John inquiry is not one story told once. It is many readings of the same core events, each shaped by the tools and assumptions of its time. The earliest reading emphasized witness observation and public recognition. The middle years emphasized suspect elimination and institutional memory. The later years turned towards science, chain of custody, and the discipline of threshold evidence. Each phase inherited the earlier one. None could entirely replace it. That is why the case remains so difficult to summarize cleanly. To speak of Bible John is to speak at once about 3 nights in Glasgow, one powerful witness account, a public sketch, decades of suspect theories, and the slow arrival of forensic testing that clarified some things while still leaving the center empty. Even the phrase empty needs care. The file is not empty. It is dense. It holds names, routes, dates, descriptions, and comparisons. What it does not yet hold is the one convergence that would settle the matter beyond serious doubt. This continued absence invited more theory. One line of thought asked whether the killer had died young before police could ever identify him. That would explain, at least in part, why he seemed to vanish. Another suggested he may have left Glasgow, or even Scotland, taking his habits elsewhere. Others believed the police had once been near the truth and then lost it through the limits of the period. Still others suspected that the man had been known in some quiet way to people around him, but never so openly suspected that the information reached police in time. All of these possibilities can coexist in an unsolved case. That does not make them equal. It only means the file must remain open to more than one ending. Some later reviews also reconsidered whether all emphasis on the Barrowland itself had perhaps become too fixed. The Ballroom was clearly central. It linked the cases socially and geographically. But the crucial question was not only who entered that room, it was who understood the flow around it. The streets after closing, the transport choices available to women at that hour, the habits of groups separating at the end of a night. A local man would know those patterns. A man visiting occasionally might know them too, if he came often enough or had reason to work nearby. So geography remained a living line of inquiry, even in the forensic era. When names resurfaced, detectives still compared addresses and practical movement. Could he have traveled in and out with ease? Did he know the East End well enough to move without uncertainty? Was there anything in his work, family, or social life that placed him naturally near the Barrowland scene. These were old questions, but they did not stop mattering just because science had entered the picture. Science did not replace geography, it sat beside it. The same was true of witness language. Even after decades, Jean Langford's recollection still mattered because it captured interaction, not merely sight. She had heard the man speak. She had watched how he conducted himself. Later, investigators could question how much weight to place on each detail, but they could not simply dismiss the account. Without it, the suspect became too diffuse. With it, he risked becoming too fixed. That balance remained one of the case's hardest problems. And because it remained unresolved, every later suspect had to pass through the same narrow gate. Does he fit the remembered man? Not only the face, the manner, the speech, the way he used social respectability as cover, if that is what he did. Many men looked close. Far fewer felt right in the round. Yet feeling right was not enough either. Again and again the file returned to its familiar discipline. Paper first. Evidence first, then interpretation. This is not how the public experiences mysteries. The public experiences them through image, suggestion, and the almost irresistible pull of story. The Bible John case generated all three. It had a memorable nickname, a sketch known across Scotland, a witness whose account was unusually rich, a famous venue, a city still able to picture those dance hall nights. All the ingredients of enduring narrative were there. The difficulty was that narrative, by itself, never solved anything. The file continued, year after year, to demand things narrative could not provide. Chain of custody, stable comparison points, independent corroboration, the exact status of each suspect as more than a rumor. In that sense, the later forensic period was not only about technology, it was about discipline. Technology simply made the discipline more visible. You could no longer say a suspect was probably right just because he fit the old composite and had troubled relatives. Now you had to ask whether preserved evidence could support that claim. And if it could not, the claim weakened sharply. This is one reason later commentary on the case often sounds more cautious than earlier speculation. People learned, slowly, that the file had fewer certainties than the legend around it. At the same time, caution did not erase the emotional force of the surviving account. Jean Langford's presence in the case remained extraordinary. Because she survived, there was a voice close to the center, a witness who had not merely heard about the suspect, but sat with him and listened. That is rare in a murder case of this kind. It gave the inquiry a level of texture many old files never have. It also meant that later generations, reading her account, could almost feel the night unfold more clearly than in the other linked killings. And that clarity, paradoxically, may have contributed to later overconfidence. A vivid account feels complete. But vivid and complete are different things. A witness can remember the atmosphere of a man very well and still not give police enough to name him. That is exactly the condition this case lived in. A strong atmosphere. An incomplete identity. As the years continued, historians and crime writers naturally became part of the broader conversation. They were not the investigators, but they influenced how the public thought about the file. Some emphasized certain suspects, others focused on missed opportunities. Some treated the witness sketch almost as settled truth. Others highlighted its limitations. This secondary literature mattered because it fed back into tip generation. A person reading an article might see an old acquaintance in a description and contact police. A family, stirred by a documentary, might decide to share private suspicions it had kept for decades. When that happened, detectives had to separate what was newly useful from what was merely newly loud. A fresh wave of attention can make an old case feel active again, but activity and progress aren't the same thing. So, the later reviews often began the same way, by slowing everything down. A new name would come in or an old name would return, and someone would sit with the files until the temperature dropped. That image matters. Not a dramatic war room, just a desk, a stack of statements, a map of Glasgow, and the old effort to keep proportion, because proportion is easy to lose in a case like this. If one suspect has already lived in the public mind for years, every new fact tends to lean toward him. If one witness sketch has become iconic, every face is compared to that image first, and the deeper record only second. The police could not afford to work in that order. They had to begin with what was documentable. That meant the chronology of the three murders stayed important, even after decades of theory. Patricia Docker in February of 1968, Jemima MacDonald in August of 1969, Helen Puttock in October of 1969. Those dates did not change. The practical questions around them did not change either. Who was in Glasgow then? Who had access to the city at night? Who fit the likely age range at that point in time? Not in hindsight, but then. Who could be placed, even loosely, within the social world of dance halls, taxis, and late journeys home? A suspect who looked right in a photograph from the 1980s might be the wrong age in the late 1960s. A man who seemed plausible because of later reputation might have lived too far away, worked incompatible hours, or simply not matched the actual movements the case required. So the investigation kept returning to simple comparisons. Age against date, address against route, known habits against witness language. That is the rhythm of careful review, and often, in that rhythm, a suspect weakened quietly. Not with a dramatic exclusion, just with one ordinary fact too many. This is why so many later theories remained frustratingly incomplete. They usually contained something real, a resemblance, a family concern, a rumor inside police circles, a history that made people uneasy. But a real element inside a theory does not make the whole theory sound. Sometimes the resemblance was persuasive, but the movements were wrong. Sometimes the address looked promising, but the witness detail did not hold. Sometimes the suspect had a troubling history, but no reliable path into the actual sequence of these nights. And because this case had become so famous, weak theories did not fade as quickly as they might have in a quieter file. They lingered, they were repeated, they hardened in the public imagination. A suspect named often enough can begin to feel almost official, even when the case papers remain unconvinced. That tension between public certainty and investigative caution stayed with the inquiry. It also shaped how police spoke about the case in later years. Serving officers tended to be measured. Retired officers, freed from institutional restraint, were sometimes less so. That difference mattered. A retired detective might say he had always favored a particular man. A journalist, hearing that, might frame the suspect as the near solution to the whole mystery. Then the wider public would absorb that idea without seeing the qualifiers that still existed in the file. Those qualifiers were often the entire point. Did the suspect match all three cases, or mainly the public image from one? Was he truly local to the right area, or merely associated with Glasgow in a broad sense? Could the evidence place him in meaningful proximity, or was the theory built from personality and resemblance alone? These are not small distinctions. In a cold case, they are everything. By now, another practical issue had become impossible to ignore. Time had not only aged the people involved, it had also aged the file itself. Some statements had been typed from original notes, some had been summarized by later officers, some names appeared in one index but not another. A lead dismissed in one era might return in a different form years later, because the original reason for dismissal had not been recorded clearly enough. This is how duplication happens in old investigations. The same man is reconsidered not because the evidence changed, but because institutional memory thinned. So part of the later work was almost archival. It involved rebuilding the case's own internal clarity, what had already been checked, which suspects had been looked at seriously, which had only brushed the edges of the inquiry, which witness accounts stood independently of media influence, and which arrived after the case had become widely known. Cold case work often sounds forensic from the outside, but much of it is really about reading old police language carefully, reading what an officer meant when he wrote that a suspect had been looked at and discounted. discounted why. On what basis? By whom? And was that basis still sound under later standards? The Bible John case demanded that kind of reading again and again. It also demanded realism about what a later breakthrough could actually look like. Popular imagination often wants a solved ending to arrive in one clean motion. A preserved sample produces a profile. The profile identifies a man. The man explains the witness account, the geography, and the years of silence all at once. Real cold cases almost never unfold so neatly. More often, modern methods trim away false confidence. They confirm that some long-discussed suspect was not the answer. They clarify that one exhibit is usable and another is not. They show that a theory built around a dramatic resemblance cannot survive comparison. That kind of progress is quiet, but it changes the shape of the file. It makes the remaining uncertainty more honest. And in the Barrowland inquiry, honesty mattered because the case had gathered so much mythology around itself. Even the nickname had become a problem of sorts. Bible John was useful shorthand, but shorthand can distort. It encouraged people to imagine a specific sort of man, perhaps austere, perhaps intensely devout, perhaps almost theatrical in his religious speech. Yet the actual witness material was narrower than the legend that grew from it. There were remembered remarks. There was a moralizing tone. There were comments that struck people because they felt unusual in that setting. But from those fragments, a whole personality had been built. That personality could guide the public. It could also mislead the investigation if taken too literally. Some later officers recognized this. They did not discard Jean Langford's account. They simply tried to read it without the overlay of decades. What did she actually say at the earliest stage? Which details remained stable? Which later descriptions may have been sharpened by repetition? What in her account was direct observation, and what was interpretation? This is subtle work. A witness may say a man seemed disapproving. That may be true as an impression, but the file must ask what behavior produced that impression. His words, his tone. A pause, a comment about drink, a remark about marriage. Those concrete elements can be tested against other accounts more usefully than the larger feeling alone. And once investigators reduced the witness material to those more exact parts, the case became both stronger and narrower. Stronger because it leaned on things that were more stable. Narrower because some of the dramatic coloring fell away. That process had consequences for suspect review. Men who fit the broad legend but not the exact details began to weaken. Men who had been proposed mainly because they seemed religious, strict, or socially awkward were no longer as persuasive if their connection to the actual geography and timing remained poor. On the other hand, suspects who fit the age, roots, and social confidence of the case could no longer be dismissed simply because they did not look like a perfect embodiment of the nickname. This was an important shift. It moved the inquiry a little away from folklore and back towards behavior. The behavior that mattered was plain enough. A man comfortable approaching women in a public social setting, a man who could talk for a long stretch without causing immediate alarm, a man who could move from ballroom conversation to private journey, a man who appeared sufficiently ordinary that witnesses noticed him only afterward, when it was too late. That pattern is not dramatic, but it is specific. It also suggests that the suspect was not a ghost passing through the city by chance. He knew enough about Glasgow after dark to use it. He understood the closing rhythms of the Barrowland and its surroundings. He could insert himself into a woman's route home without standing out. And this returned the case, once more, to the city itself. Glasgow was not only backdrop, it was a working element in the inquiry. Investigators continued to compare suspects against the practical life of the city in the late 1960s. Did he use public transport? Did he own or have access to a car? Did he live with family? And if so, how freely could he come and go late at night? Did his work schedule place him on shifts that made nocturnal movement unremarkable? Could he have appeared neat and composed after an evening out, because that was simply how he habitually presented himself? These are not glamorous questions. They are also the reason some suspects endured longer in the file than others. A man with no record, no scandal, and no dramatic story can be more difficult to eliminate than a notorious figure. The notorious figure at least leaves tracks. The quiet one may leave almost none. As forensic review proceeded, that possibility became harder to ignore. Perhaps the killer had never become famous in any other way. Perhaps he had not gone on to a career of known violence. Perhaps he had died without ever entering police systems meaningfully again. That thought is unsettling in a calm way. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary. The city may have held him for years without knowing. He may have worked, traveled, attended family events, and aged like anyone else. He may have grown less recognizably like the sketch with every passing year, until the face Glasgow searched for no longer existed, even in his own mirror. This possibility also explains something else, why the case felt both close and unreachable. A known offender can be studied through records. An unknown ordinary man leaves much less. If he confided in no one, or only in ways nobody understood at the time, then the file is left with traces rather than testimony. That is the condition many cold cases eventually reach. And in response, the investigation becomes less about dramatic discovery than about protecting the remaining fragments from distortion. The Barrowland murders had reached that stage. There were still leads. There were still suspects to compare. There were still scientific avenues within limits. But there was also a growing awareness that every generation handling the file could accidentally make it worse if it became overconfident. An old mystery can be damaged by certainty as much as by neglect. So some of the best later work was cautious by design. It sought to preserve options rather than close them too quickly. If one suspect was excluded, that exclusion was noted carefully. If a witness account seemed less dependable on one detail than once thought, that did not mean the whole account failed. It meant the weighting changed. If one exhibit could not sustain a clean conclusion, the review did not force one. This restraint may sound unsatisfying, but it kept the case usable. And a usable case has a future. A myth does not. There was also a broader institutional effect. As Scottish policing changed across decades, major unsolved cases like this one became reference points for how reviews should be conducted. The Barrowland file taught lessons about evidence retention, witness contamination, and the danger of allowing publicity to shape investigative assumptions. It also taught something simpler. That unresolved does not mean inactive. A case can remain unsolved and still be worked honestly, repeatedly, and with care. Families often understand that distinction better than anyone. They know the difference between a file being closed emotionally by the public and being kept alive practically by police. In this case, the families of the women had lived through years in which the city remembered the nickname more easily than the victims themselves. That imbalance is common in famous unsolved murders. The suspect becomes legend. The people harmed by him recede. Some later commentary tried to correct that. It returned attention to Patricia Docker, to Jemima MacDonald, and to Helen Puttock as individuals with lives, families, routines, and ordinary plans interrupted by the worst kind of uncertainty. That mattered, not simply as moral framing, but as investigative grounding. When detectives look at a case only through the suspect, they can become captive to his mythology. When they return to the victim's actual movements, relationships, and habits, the inquiry regains texture. It asks again what was known, what was assumed, and where the points of contact truly were. For example, Patricia Docker's case remained a reminder of how difficult reconstruction can be when an evening begins under one stated plan and unfolds under another. Her husband believed she had gone elsewhere. Later inquiry pointed toward the Barrowland. That discrepancy never entirely disappeared. It became part of the caution built into the linked case theory. Not enough to break the link, but enough to remind later investigators that the first case was, in some ways, the least cleanly observed. Jemima MacDonald's murder, too, retained areas of uncertainty. Its place in the pattern was strong, but not because every detail lined up perfectly. Rather, It fit the recurring social and geographic shape of the inquiry. That is how linked cases often work. Not as copies, but as overlaps. And then there was Helen Puttock's night, the most documented of the three because of Jean Langford's presence. That account always exerted a gravitational pull on the whole file. The risk was obvious. The most detailed case can begin to dominate the less detailed ones until the combined pattern starts reflecting one witness too strongly. Later review had to guard against that. It asked whether the suspect behavior inferred from Helen's night could genuinely be carried backward into the earlier cases. In broad terms, yes. In every detail, not safely. That answer may feel modest. It is also exactly the kind of answer a mature cold case often gives. Broad coherence, incomplete precision. This careful balancing became even more important whenever the media revived interest. A book, a newspaper series, or a television documentary could bring enormous public energy to the case. With that energy came opportunities. New witnesses might come forward. A relative might finally decide to name a man privately discussed in the family for years. Someone sorting through the possessions of a dead parent might find old letters, photographs, or notes that unexpectedly touched the inquiry. These things do happen, but media attention also pulls in a different kind of material. People begin to remember themselves into the story. An ordinary dance partner from decades ago becomes, in recollection, possibly the suspect. A difficult uncle becomes, after family conversation, almost certainly the man in the sketch. An offhand remark from long ago is recast as sinister because the case has supplied a frame around it. The detectives had to sort all of this patiently, and patience in such moments is not passivity, it is active filtering. One by one, the new claims are compared to old facts. One by one, the dramatic edges are trimmed away. What remains, if anything, is entered into the file in the quiet language that long investigations require. Some later tipsters did bring concrete information. Old addresses, old workplace details, photographs from the period, descriptions of family habits that could actually be tested. These were valuable because they reduced speculation to checkable points. An uncle was no longer only said to resemble the sketch. A photograph could be dated. A work roster could be requested. A bus route or military posting could be compared to the known chronology. This is how a cold case stays real. It keeps converting story back into paper. And sometimes paper does something important. It doesn't solve the case. It simply removes one more illusion. A man long thought central turns out to have been somewhere else. A supposed church-going habit appears exaggerated. An address, thought to place someone near the Barrowland, turns out to belong to a later period, not the relevant year. The result is not revelation, it is narrowing. And narrowing, over time, is what gives even an unsolved file its shape. Another recurring issue in this inquiry was the meaning of the suspect's apparent composure. Witnesses, especially in relation to Helen's evening, described a man who did not seem chaotic. He seemed controlled. That fact has often been interpreted in different ways. Some saw in it a man with military bearing. Others saw a strict religious upbringing. Others simply saw social intelligence. Police could not let any one interpretation become doctrine. Composure can come from many sources. A man may be disciplined. He may merely be practiced. He may present himself carefully because he knows it helps him move through public spaces without trouble. This ambiguity is important because it shaped the suspect pool. If the inquiry leaned too heavily toward former servicemen, it risked missing civilians who carried themselves similarly. If it leaned too heavily toward overt religiosity, it risked missing men who only performed moral certainty when useful. The case had to remain open to both. That openness kept the field larger than anyone wanted, but it also kept the work honest. There was no shortage of men in Glasgow and beyond it who could appear neat, self-contained, and respectable for an evening. The distinctive part was not any single trait. It was the combination, the setting, the approach, the remarks, the route away from the dance hall, the repeated connection to women whose nights crossed the same social ground. Only a suspect who fit enough of those pieces at once could move near the center of the file, and still, even then, the evidential threshold remained high. This was especially true once forensic standards hardened. Earlier decades had allowed more room for intuitive policing. A suspect could remain prominent because experienced officers believed in him strongly. By the late 20th century and into the next, belief had less standing on its own. It still mattered as a guide. An old detective's instinct might point reviewers toward a name worth reconsidering, but instinct had to hand the case over to evidence eventually. And evidence, when old, is merciless in its limits. It tells you only what it can still support. This changed the emotional texture of the investigation. There were fewer grand claims, more guarded statements, more emphasis on what had been excluded than on what had been proved. To the public, that can sound disappointing. Inside the case, it was often a sign of maturity. The file was becoming less theatrical, more exact. That exactness also led some investigators to revisit not only suspects, but assumptions about sequence. Was the same offender certainly responsible for all three murders? Most likely, yes. But how much did the offender's method evolve between the first and third? Did the confidence seen in Helen's case reflect a man who had become more practiced over time? Or is that only an illusion created by the richer witness detail available in that final case? These questions are difficult because they sit at the edge of inference. Still, they affected how reviewers thought about the suspect. If his confidence increased over time, perhaps the later witness account was capturing a more established pattern. If not, then maybe the same level of social control had always been present, only less visible in the earlier files. Again, no single answer settled in permanently. The investigation had to live with conditional thinking. This may be one reason the case has remained so haunting in public memory. Not because it is full of endless shocks, but because almost every strong point contains some restraint. The pattern is persuasive, but not perfect. The witness is vivid, but not all-seeing. The sketch is famous, but not photographic. The suspects are plausible, but not provable. The forensic work is helpful, but not complete. Every part of the case offers something and then stops. That repeated stopping point is what makes long detective work necessary. And long detective work changes the people who do it. Officers assigned later to the Ballroom file often inherited more than evidence. They inherited the tone of the case, a certain seriousness, a sense that public language had to be used carefully, a recognition that this was not simply a puzzle, but one of Scotland's most enduring unsolved murder investigations. That kind of inheritance can be heavy. It can also be stabilizing. A famous case is at risk of becoming performance. That risk grows when a case becomes part of a country's memory, because memory likes a clean outline, and the file rarely offers one. What the later investigators tried to protect was not a myth, but a method. They kept returning to the same careful sequence. What can be proved? What can be excluded? What still rests only on resemblance, rumor, or repetition? That sequence matters because the Bible John case has always been pulled in two directions at once. One direction is public imagination. The other is evidential restraint. You can feel that pull most strongly in the years when named suspects began to rise and fall in public view. A name would appear in a newspaper report, or in a documentary, or in the recollection of a retired officer. Very quickly, the old sketch would be brought back beside it. People would compare the forehead, the nose, the jawline, the hair. They would compare stories about manners, religion, drink, and women. For a while, the suspect would seem almost close enough to touch. Then the slower checks would begin, address histories, family accounts, work records, military service, where relevant. The practical question of whether the man could actually be placed within the geography of those nights. And usually, after all that, the answer remained incomplete. Not false in every respect, just not enough. That repeated pattern is one reason the case remains open. Not because nobody has looked hard, because many people have. Because names have been tested against the file again and again, and the file has continued to ask for more than anyone could give. In the years of modern review, this became clearer than ever. The police had old witness material, preserved exhibits, and decades of accumulated theory. What they did not have was the luxury of certainty, so they moved carefully. Where science could eliminate, they let it eliminate. Where it could narrow, they let it narrow. Where it could not carry the case to an identification, they did not pretend otherwise. That choice may sound quiet. It was also one of the most important choices in the whole long life of the investigation. Because once an old case begins to speak in stronger claims than its evidence can support, it drifts into performance. And performance solves nothing. So the final shape of the inquiry became a shape of discipline. Named suspects were reconsidered. Some were weakened, some remained interesting but unproven. The famous public portrait was respected, but not worshipped. The witness account remained central, but not beyond question. The preserved evidence was valued, but read within its limits. This is not the satisfying architecture of a solved case. It is the architecture of an honest, unsolved one. And honesty in a file this old is a kind of achievement. It allows the case to keep breathing. It allows future investigators to inherit something usable, not just something famous. There is another part of the story that matters here, and it is less often discussed. Old investigations change police culture. A case like this, one does not simply wait on a shelf. It teaches. It teaches officers what can happen when witness memory becomes public property too quickly. It teaches the importance of preserving exhibits that may not seem vital at the time. It teaches how easily a nickname can help and distort in the same motion. It teaches that a suspect who seems emotionally convincing may still fail under plain documentation. And perhaps most of all, it teaches patience. Not passive waiting, active patience. The sort that keeps checking names, keeps reading statements, keeps reviewing routes, addresses, and dates, keeps the dead present in the institution long after the first detectives are gone. By then, the city itself had changed around the case. Glasgow was no longer the Glasgow of late 1969. The transport habits were different. The neighborhoods had changed. The social world of the Barrowland had shifted with time, and yet the name still carried its old echo. People still knew the phrase. They still knew the sketch. They still knew, in broad outline, that a man had moved through dance hall nights and never been conclusively named. That endurance gave the case unusual weight. Not every unsolved murder remains part of civic memory across generations. This one did, partly because of the witness account, partly because of the nickname, partly because there were 3 women linked by pattern and place, and partly because the case seemed for so long to hover just short of resolution. Always one suspect away, always one comparison away, always one fresh review away. That nearness has its own power. It keeps people looking. It keeps journalists returning. It keeps retired officers talking. It keeps families listening for any shift in the file. But nearness is not closure. The Barrowland murders remain one of those cases where the public can feel close to an answer without the law ever reaching one. That distinction is painful but necessary. A strong hunch is not a solved case. A persuasive suspect is not a proved one. A famous theory is not a verdict. So what remains, after all these years, is not emptiness. It is a set of enduring facts and a set of enduring limits. The facts are these. 3 women were killed between February of 1968 and October of 1969. The Barrowland connection gave police reason to join the cases. Witnesses described a neatly dressed, controlled, conversational man. Jean Langford's account gave that man a vivid public form. The city and the press called him Bible John. Detectives spent decades testing names against that form. Later, forensic review helped exclude some possibilities and reframe others. And still the inquiry stopped short of final certainty. The limits are just as important. Memory changed with time. Publicity altered recollection. The most famous sketch was never a photograph. The most discussed suspects never reached the threshold the case required. The available science clarified some questions, but not all. The evidence that survived did not settle the central one. Who was he? That question has lasted because the case was built on both strength and fragility. Strong pattern, fragile identification, strong witness recollection, fragile public interpretation, strong cultural memory, fragile legal certainty. When you look at it that way, the case becomes easier to understand, even if it does not become easier to solve. It was never a mystery held together by a single brilliant clue waiting to be noticed. It was held together by accumulation, by patient comparison, by the quiet work of joining streets to statements, statements to sketches, sketches to names, names to records, and records back again to the stubborn silence at the center. There is something almost archival about that silence now. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just persistent. A file opened, closed, and opened again. A photograph studied under one generation's light, then another's. A label on an old exhibit checked against a property register. A witness sentence read once more, with fresh caution. A suspect theory tested, then loosened from the file when it could not hold. This is what the long afterlife of an unsolved case looks like. Not pursuit in the ordinary sense, maintenance, attention, care, and in that care the women themselves remain the true center, even when public memory has sometimes pushed them to the edges. Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald, Helen Puttock. Their names matter because unsolved cases can become overly attached to the unknown man and forget the known lives interrupted by him. The best later work tried not to make that mistake. It kept returning to who they were, where they had gone, what was known of their evenings, and how the investigation had tried to follow them home through the dark. That return gave the case its human shape again, not a legend, a set of absences that other people spent years trying to answer. There is, too, the quieter memory of those who worked it, the original detectives, writing and rewriting their comparisons in the late 1960s and early 70s, the later officers inheriting shelves of material and trying to decide which assumptions should survive, the forensic reviewers, years later, asking new questions of old preservation, the retired officers who still carried one or two names in mind, the family members who lived with suspicion, or with hope, or with both. A case like this belongs to all of them in different ways, not because any one of them solved it, because each contributed to the long refusal to let it vanish. And that refusal has meaning. It means that unsolved does not have to mean abandoned. It means that even without an ending, there can be diligence. Even without certainty, there can be standards. Even without an arrest, there can be serious repeated acts of remembrance. By the time you reach the end of a file like this, what stands out most may not be the suspect at all. It may be the duration. How long careful people stayed with the question. How often the case returned for review. How much of detective work is simply the willingness to continue reading when no immediate reward appears. That is true in many cold cases, but especially here. The Bible John investigation has lasted because it always contained just enough to justify another look, another comparison, another review of an old suspect, another attempt to balance the vividness of witness memory against the caution required by age and publicity. Another effort to ask whether some ordinary administrative detail, preserved almost by habit, might still matter. Those are small acts. Taken together, they become the shape of the whole case. And still, after all of that, the file remains open. Open in the practical sense. Open in the historical sense. Open in the emotional sense, too. Because unresolved cases do not sit still in the lives of families or cities. They shift slightly with each anniversary, each documentary, each newspaper article, each rumor brought back into light. Then they settle again, quietly, without answer. There is no dramatic final reveal to place here. No clean naming that would make every earlier uncertainty feel purposeful. Only the record of an investigation that changed with time and yet remained, in its essentials, the same. A man moved through Glasgow nights. He left a pattern, Witnesses tried to remember him. Police tried to locate him in the ordinary structures of the city. Later generations tried again with science, with archives, with stricter standards, with old evidence and new restraint. The answer did not come, but the work remained careful. That may be the most accurate ending this case allows. Not closure, not collapse, just continued attention. A file still read, a city still remembering. A name given by newspapers, but no name proven by law. When people speak about Bible John now, they often speak as if the mystery lives in the suspect alone. But perhaps part of the mystery lives in the investigation itself, in how much can be known and still not enough, in how a witness can bring you close and not close enough, in how evidence can survive for decades and still stop just short of certainty, in how a city can carry the outline of a man it never truly identified. That is the enduring shape of it. Not a chase, a long study of patience, error, preservation, memory, and the limits of all of them. And if you imagine the case one last time, it does not need to be imagined loudly. Just an old desk, a lamp, a sketch in a folder, 3 names that still matter, notes in different hands from different decades. One theory crossed through, another left open, a route marked on a map, a witness sentence underlined. And then, beyond the paperwork, the city itself. The buses, the streets after midnight, the old ballroom doors, the ordinary places that became part of an extraordinary absence. The file is still open, the questions are still there. Who was the man in the taxi? How much of the public portrait was true? Which suspect, if any, came closest? Whether the answer was once almost reached or never truly near at all. Those questions remain. But for now, they can